New polling shows voters give Kamala Harris the edge on handling gun violence. Plus, a new Senate bill aims to force the military to initiate red flag laws. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. Speaking of gun politics, we have some new polling data about the current presidential race. We have a new poll that actually you reported on showing that by about a 5-point margin, voters say they currently trust candidate Kamala Harris on the issue of gun violence over President Trump. So, we've talked about in previous episodes how there's been fairly limited polling data so far when it comes to guns, but this is at least one of the first big indications in a while where voters are leaning one way or the other, whatever gun violence may mean to them.
Yeah. And Fox News also, in the same vein, had a poll where they followed up the one we reported on previously, where Trump was leading Harris by 3 points on guns. So this is the other,
right.
These polls aren't consistent in how they phrase things. It's usually a really big problem around, so-called assault weapons bans. You'll get all kinds of wild phrasings that pollsters will ask, and they don't seem to actually really even understand the policy proposal they're trying to poll. Super common problem in media, as I think our audience knows well. It's kind of why we exist as a publication to some degree, trying to improve coverage of guns in media. But yes, we had the ABC News Ipsos poll that had Harris up, was it 4 points or 5 points on gun violence? And then Fox News had Trump up 1 point on guns. So, and these are kind of, as far as comparing the candidates go, the only polls that we've really gotten in recent weeks on this question. And so they kind of tell a similar thing, which is it's a close, Americans aren't like wildly divergent on this issue like they are on some other ones where you have, right, for instance, immigration. Trump tends to lead by a lot on immigration, protecting democracy. Harris tends to lead by a lot on that. The economy has been a little bit more of it's gotten closer on the economy lately, but Trump has led on that for most of the race. But yeah, I mean, the guns, it's been pretty close. One way or the other. And it's obviously a positive poll for Harris in the ABC News survey. But the other big takeaway from it was the fact that Americans don't rate this issue very highly. And that there was a lot more polling on that. There were 3 or 4 more polls that looked at that question where people rank the issue. And, the takeaway was that it hasn't moved much. We talked, you had a piece last week, analysis piece for members that looked at whether or not voters are deprioritizing guns. And it does seem like that's the case. Although I think that the poll we looked at then was even more so, because probably in large part because they didn't, those couple polls that we looked at didn't ask about a lot of different issues.
Right.
But guns were at the bottom of the list. Now this newer batch of poll puts them in a similar range of how many people have guns to the top issue, maybe 5 or 6%. And when they're asked, they also ask these things a little bit differently too. Like some will ask, what's your top issue? And you can only say one issue. And that's where guns will tend to be in that 5, 6 lower end ranking. And then some of them will ask, what are your top issues? And you can leave more than one. And guns will be maybe 19, 20% range on those. But what's consistent is the issue tends to be a mid-level issue most of the time. And that's what these new polls are showing. It's a mid-level issue. And, it may be ahead of abortion in some polls, behind abortion in other polls, ahead of like crime or any number of non-economic issues. But it generally sits in that middle range. And what that really tells us, I think, is the recent shooting at the Georgia high school and the debate have not moved voters' interest, really, not significantly, not enough to make guns a top issue in the race. That's, I think, the key takeaway, because we've talked about this in the past, not that long ago, like right before the Georgia shooting. Unfortunately, there haven't been a lot of high-profile gun violence incidents this year. There wasn't even a mass shooting that met the Violence Project's criteria until the Georgia high school shooting. And so it hasn't gotten a lot of media attention. It hasn't been at the top of mind for most voters most of the year. And when that happens, you tend to see it float around the mid-pack as far as issue importance. And so we were wondering, well, what could change that? And, obviously a major mass shooting could change that. And it seems like the Georgia high school shooting, in terms of attention on the issue, on the politics of guns, hasn't shifted that. And neither did the debate. The debate was highly watched. It was a lot more people tuned into it than they did the first one. I think it may have been the highest rated debate ever, technically, as far as like number of people who've watched, which would make sense because the population goes up every cycle. So every year it's going to be the most, the most people will turn out to vote in a presidential election every year because there's more people than there were the last time around. But so there may be some effect there as far as the debate goes, but it was very highly watched. A lot of people watched it, and a lot of people even noted that they made a poll that showed, and we're talking about scientific polls, random samples, representative samples, not like online polling that's easily manipulated or things like that. We're just talking about the kind of polling that would be included in Real Clear Politics or Decision Desk or 538, Nate Silver, their averages. These are more significant polls than like a Drudge poll or Twitter poll or whatever. Those aren't, those other polls just don't have the same scientific rigor. They don't sample, they don't do anything to try and figure out if the sample is representative of the population they're trying to poll. So just to be clear on that. And, polling is not a perfect predictor of what's going to happen in an election. That's not really how they work. They're more of a blurry snapshot in time, and they can tell you some things, but you shouldn't be necessarily obsessed with every percentage point in every poll and how it's moved one way or the other. There's going to be variation. And it's just to lay the groundwork on talking about this stuff, because I understand it's controversial to some people, and also it's just widely misunderstood how polling works and what the differences are. This is why we talk about this stuff, because the scientific polls are more serious. They give you a better chance of understanding what's going on than anecdotes or non-scientific polling does. So that's why we spend time looking at this stuff. But regardless, there was a poll that showed most people had heard, for instance, Harris's line that she owns guns. That was her main thrust of her answer in the debate. And a pollster asked people if they had heard about that, and they had. So people did watch this debate, and they did hear some of the messaging on, at the very least, what Harris said about owning a gun. And so it got through. Same thing with the Georgia shooting. 90% of people polled heard about that. It hasn't moved the issue to a top tier issue. And so that's my big takeaway from looking at these polls. The issue is relatively close as far as how voters rank the candidates. It's not one where you see a significant advantage for one candidate or the other when these questions are asked, like on some other issues. But it's also not one where Americans are making it the top priority in their minds. And that hasn't shifted since the Georgia shooting or the debate, which were two things that could have potentially shifted it. And it doesn't appear like they have. That's my big takeaway.
Yeah, and it's one of those things where historically, like I mentioned this in the members piece that you brought up, where it's not like guns have never been a highly ranked issue. Just in 2022 in the midterms, we saw voters consistently ranking it in the top 2 or 3 issues, frankly. So it is interesting that despite these things that we tend to see interest in guns go up, mass shootings or something high profile like a presidential debate that everyone's watching, didn't seem to move the needle one way or the other. But we have seen, maybe not among voters, but among the candidates themselves, a continued focus a little bit on guns, not real substantive gun policy discussions, but as you sort of discussed in your other piece this week, we've seen Kamala Harris talk about it a little bit more. She's kind of settled into this line that she likes to talk about where she's, I'm a gun owner, I'm not taking anyone's guns away. And she said a few other interesting things this week that you noted.
Yeah, and we're going to talk a lot more about this with Cam Edwards, who's going to be the guest on the interview podcast this week. So we're not going to get too deep into it. But another thing that we saw this week is that the politics, part of this realization that voters are not moving on the issue coincides with the candidates not moving on the issue either. Probably because the voters haven't moved much. They're not paying much more attention to this. You're not seeing huge shifts in who they favor necessarily. Like, yes, Harris has a couple-point lead in that ABC poll. Trump has a 1-point lead, but these aren't huge. It's not double-digit advantages for either candidate on this issue. And it hasn't moved a ton since the previous polling. The last Fox poll had Trump up by 3 points instead of 1 point, right? You're not seeing a huge shift from voters. And so, the other thing is you're not seeing a huge shift from candidates. They have really zeroed in on what they want to say. Whether these are the best arguments they can make or not is a different question, but they clearly, you have on the one hand, Trump talking consistently. He was just on Gutfeld's show on Fox News last night saying these exact things. And he said it basically every time he's talked about guns since the RNC at the very least, maybe really even going back to like the NRA annual meeting. But basically he argues that gun owners don't vote, that if only they would all vote the way he wants them to, they would win. It's sort of a shaming people into voting kind of thing. Gun owners don't vote, and that's why they don't get what they want. He has this for a bunch of groups, right? Just saying the same thing to like this Jewish event that happened the other night. And also, usually when he brings up gun owners, he's also talking about evangelical voters. Same basic line. And then the other line that he's added more recently that he also repeats every time he talks about guns is that Kamala Harris wants to take people's guns, wants to take everyone's guns. So those are the two things that he will consistently say. That's his messaging on guns. And he hasn't moved. We talked about the possibility he might after he got shot, right, himself. There's some, he hasn't always been rock solid on these things, at least from a rhetorical standpoint or stuff he said. And then obviously he also, excuse me, he also did, so like the bump stock ban or what have you. So there's some possibility he might change his mind, and he hasn't. And there was another assassination attempt that didn't get quite as far as the first one, thankfully, but another serious threat, and hasn't moved him on policy. And I think that means he's pretty well locked in at this point. It would take a lot for the dynamic to change, I think, for either of these candidates. But Trump, I think, has shown that he's not going to change necessarily his view on guns for the rest of this race. I think he's going to stick with those two lines. Similarly, Harris, like you mentioned, every time now since the debate, every single time she's talked about guns, there's been at least 3 or 4 interviews or media appearances since then, or fundraiser appearances. she's talked about being a gun owner, and how because she's a gun owner, she's not going to take anyone's guns. And then she repeats the same three policies that she supports, which are universal background checks, red flag laws, and a ban on the sale of assault weapons. She has not backtracked into supporting stricter provisions or confiscation, mandatory buybacks. She hasn't talked about her history of even opposing Heller or instituting microstamping requirements. And there was an interview with the National Association of Black Journalists this week where she did talk at length on gun policy. And she was pressed by, I think NPR's Mosley is the reporter's name. And she pressed Harris for specific policies related to handguns. And Harris stuck with the same policies, assault weapons ban, universal background checks. She did talk a bit about community violence intervention programs and mental health funding, but she didn't go. I thought what was the bigger takeaway to me was that she didn't go back to a number of those further left policies she supported in the past. She didn't, because those all really had to do with handguns. Microstamping that was led to effectively a ban on new models of handguns in California for like a decade before it was struck down. And then, Heller was all about a total ban on the ownership of handguns in Washington, D.C., which she argued in a brief she signed on to that didn't violate the Second Amendment. She didn't talk about any of that. Of course, we got a newly resurfaced video of her talking about a safe storage law in San Francisco, where she said in a press conference that she would send law enforcement into people's homes, lawful gun owners' homes, to inspect their guns under this new law. In 2007, it was a new law, not anymore, obviously. But, she didn't go back to any of that stuff. She's mostly avoided even talking about it or acknowledging those positions, other than to walk back the mandatory buyback one. And so that's what she's sticking with, clearly. And I don't see that changing, or any of this changing, perhaps unless there's, some major event, a major mass shooting on the level of Uvalde or Parkland or Las Vegas or something like that. Or some other unexpected but huge, race-shattering event related to guns. I don't know. I don't want to speculate on what it would probably have to be a really bad thing, to be frank. But without stuff like that happening, the race seems pretty set.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. But listeners should check out the longer interview with Cam to hear you guys kind of get more into the details of how that shakes up the politics. But some other related to the gun polling stuff. We had some other polling analysis this week from Gallup, specifically looking at something that, we've talked about this, offline. Just there's been this broad thing in sort of the popular discussion about a growing gender divide. And there's a lot of talk about young women in particular moving far to the left, more than young men. And Gallup actually provided a little bit of polling data going back to the Bush years from 2001 up until today, tracking specifically young women aged 18 to 29 and finding that they have, in fact, both in terms of their self-identification and in terms of specific policies, moved, it varies, but at least in terms of self-identification, they've moved like 15 points to the left, or the amount that say they identify as more liberal. And in terms of issues, and one of the top issues that they've moved furthest to the left on was guns, which I think is interesting. I have the piece up here. I did a piece taking a look at what some of this stuff is, and they're 16% more likely to say that gun law should be stricter, 3% more likely to say that handguns should be banned, which is interesting because that's something that we've actually seen go the opposite way among the broader public. They are 21% more likely to say that they're very dissatisfied with America's gun laws. That was the movement that they expressed the most dissatisfaction over. And so, that to me is notable that young women in particular seem to be veering away from the gun rights line or the gun rights position. And it would sort of back up this popular thesis that young women in particular are moving to the left. But I think what's not as discussed is that more than just young women are moving, at least on this issue.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because the framing you hear a lot, I think, especially online, is this idea that young women are getting more liberal and young men are getting more conservative.
Yeah.
And that actually doesn't really bear out in this, because it's not as though young men have gotten more pro-gun in this poll. They just have gotten more pro-gun control at a slower pace than young women have. And, it's not exactly something that I think any gun rights advocate would be happy to hear. It's not like there's some offset with young men. It's just that the entire population of young people is getting more open to new gun restrictions. And this kind of mirrors something we read about. It might have even been a while back now. But if you look at some of this polling, especially around just the general concept of stricter gun laws, just like what we were sort of talking about earlier with whether guns are a top issue or not, sort of fluctuates around major mass shootings or major acts of high profile gun violence. You see that as well with support for gun restrictions, where they tend to support for it rises in the immediate aftermath of these kinds of horrible attacks, and then it'll decline back down in a few months later. And that's sort of the cycle that you tend to see. I mean, it also is similar with gun sales. Gun sales can be kind of a chaos meter for how people are feeling about their personal security in the country. And so in times of chaos, like the pandemic, the early days of the pandemic, the rioting of 2020, you saw huge spikes in gun sales. And just like that, you'll usually see a huge rise and then a drop down, but the floor will be higher than the old floor. And we've seen that in polling as well. The support for stricter gun laws rises up, drops down, but the floor is still higher than it was before the spike. And it's a really bad trend if you're somebody who opposes new gun restrictions. At the very least, it's a good trend if you support them, obviously, presumably. Now they haven't been able to capitalize much on that at the national level, gun control advocates, but it's definitely a long-term trend that should be worrying for gun rights advocates. And I think this zeroing in on just young people here, like your piece, it is a problem. And it does, while the young men are not getting more conservative on the issue necessarily, it's also interesting to see that gap develop between young women and young men on this particular issue, more so than it used to be. And it says that what the gun rights movement has put together is not doing a good job of appealing to young women in particular, and it may also just be on the cultural level. I think the right is having a harder time appealing to women at this point than it used to. So it could be just a side effect of that larger problem as well. It's not necessarily that the gun industry or gun rights advocates aren't trying to appeal to younger women. It's just that younger women tend to be more put off by the right at the moment than they used to be. But it is a problem, right?
I say, I get into that a little bit in the piece, is that there was already a little bit of a higher floor for women, even traditionally.
The gaps always existed, right, to some degree.
It's just that it's sort of gone on this broader, more rapid diversion. That's, and to your point about, overall the new high floor, as gun control sort of fluctuated and got more popular at times, then receded back down. That's why I think the trend is important for the gun debate. It can be easy for, if you're a gun rights supporter, to say, oh yeah, young women, they never really were gun rights supporters anyway. So if they're going to the left, it may not move all that much. But young men, they aren't moving as fast, are still going in that direction as well. And that does, if a critical mass, a broad-based shift away from the position, that could have political ramifications down the line.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But members should check out that piece. It'll be available for them in our newsletter.
Yeah, and in the Sunday newsletter just for members. By the way, members get a special a special Sunday newsletter just for them because they're special, good people.
We also have an interesting story this week about a bill that's sort of flown a little bit under the radar, surprisingly. Maybe it has something to do with probably the election focuses on that.
Yeah.
But Senator Susan Collins of Maine, the Republican from Maine, as well as her fellow senator from Maine, Angus King, the independent, have introduced a bill as an amendment to the NDAA that would essentially require the members of the armed forces to use state red flag laws if, say, there's a service member that's exhibiting threatening behavior or has to be involuntarily committed for whatever reason. They would be required under this bill to take advantage of whatever state extreme risk protection order exists, whether that's where the service member lives or it's where they're stationed for duty or engaging in some sort of operations. They would be required to take advantage of those laws. And that's sort of an idea that we haven't really seen before, but it's obviously based on who introduced the bill and what it's dealing with. It seems to be directly tailored to the Lewiston shooting last year.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this policy before, but not at the national level or this like concept, because after the Buffalo shooting in New York, the governor there issued an order similar to this, where because one of the issues in Buffalo was that the shooter had been, I guess, well, actually, I don't know that we ever got full details on this aspect of it, but he was taken to a mental health institution by police. Maybe that was viewed as a voluntary thing. He was given an option once he got there, but the Buffalo shooter was obviously found to be a threat to himself or others by his school and the police department, but they did not initiate a red flag proceeding against him. As soon as we start talking on these podcasts, it's like a curse. Always have something comes up in my throat and it just makes it difficult. But yes, like in that situation, the police did not initiate or the school did not initiate a red flag order. And so that was part of the aftermath of the Buffalo shooting was trying to ensure that the police departments, local police departments, would have to follow through on doing that instead of making it optional. And so this is similar to that, but on a much larger scale, obviously, because the entire military. And and obviously, although I think in both those situations, you also still question why weren't these people prohibited from the mental health commitments that they'd already experienced. That this isn't. I know people look at these situations and their first thought is always to go to red flag laws because that's what gets a lot of attention at the moment. They're more recent policies that have been more talked about, but there's already a long-standing prohibition on people who've been involuntarily committed owning guns. So I think in both these situations, you can question why that prohibition wasn't triggered. But regardless, this policy does seem like one that could have some legs, maybe not in an election year like this, as an add-on to a must-pass bill. That does give it a much better chance of making it into law if they can get it in there. But it's just King and Collins at the moment. Although you would think that they have some, that's a better, co-sponsor list to start with than a lot of other gun laws are going to get, because you have a Republican and, King is technically an independent, but he's more like a moderate Democrat is how he's generally viewed on the Hill, especially on gun issues. At least perhaps up until recently. Now he's a bit, he did that whole gas operated semi-automatic ban that was just basically an assault weapon ban by a different name. And So I don't know how much his pro-gun credibility is still there, but he he was instrumental in sinking the ATF nomination the first time around from Biden. So regardless, those two seem like they might have the ability to pull in at least a few Republicans,
right,
on something like this.
Especially because it doesn't actually create red flag laws, which could be you could see that being a hot button issue in the Republican Party. It just says that, hey, states, if you already have them, you have to use them there, and you may be able to peel off a couple of moderate Republicans to get on board with something like that.
Exactly.
Our office didn't respond to me. I reached out to try to see if they were actively working to gin up extra co-sponsors or support. They're not really talking about it right now, so it's tough to say for sure. But like you said, you could see this potentially getting some legs at some point, I think.
Yeah, I think it's definitely worthwhile policy to take a look at and understand what might be coming down the road, even if it doesn't pass this session. Certainly, if Democrats win the White House and retain the Senate, which honestly at this point is not looking likely, I see it looking even less likely that they're going to retain the Senate than win the White House. But, if that were to happen, or even if, I don't know, in a scenario where there's a lot of pressure to pass a gun bill of some sort, this could be one that gets through. Even if it's a Republican Senate, but we'll see. We'll have to see. It doesn't seem to be moving quickly this time, though, yeah. And so it may just be more of a messaging bill at this point. But it's definitely one that I think has much more potential than a lot of the other proposals, red flag proposals, or even the proposals that like Harris is running on. Now she doesn't, she doesn't detail what she wants in a red flag law. So she probably would support something like this, I would imagine. But yeah, I think this has a better shot of chance of passing than, universal background checks or an assault weapons ban.
Yeah,
in reality, in real life, even if Democrats retain the Senate and win the presidency and flip the House, I think you'd be hard pressed to see them pass a universal background check or a assault weapons ban bill and get it into law. They'd have to go real extreme. They'd have to nuke the filibuster, and then even then it would face a lot of possibility of being struck down by the Supreme Court. And this is the sort of doomsday scenario that like the NRA talks about, which would be packing the court because you nuke the filibuster. And how realistic that is, I don't know. Certainly we've had people on who think David French thinks it's not likely to happen at all. Randy Kosak, who's the head of ILA at the NRA, is making that his main pitch. So people have to determine for themselves what they think could realistically happen if Democrats win the Senate or hold the Senate, it's going to be probably a 50-50 with a VP tiebreaker. So you lose a single senator on something, and nuking the filibuster is a pretty extreme. The legislative filibuster is a pretty extreme measure. So I don't know how super likely it is. Regardless, if the filibuster stays in place, or if Republicans gain control of the Senate, those are the scenarios where this bill probably has higher odds of being something that can actually get through. In theory, it'd still take a pretty heavy lift.
Right.
Yeah.
We'll keep tabs on it either way, just to see where it goes, just because it is interesting to see it get introduced, and it could end up just being a messaging bill, or maybe down the road it turns into something. But we'll have to see. Getting into some of the newsletter links, just to wrap up here. We have an interesting one from The Trace about the state of ballot measures, gun-related ballot measures this election cycle. Obviously, in the past, we've seen some busy election cycles, like Oregon, for example, the big magazine ban and permit to purchase requirement. This year, it's actually pretty quiet on that front. Only my home state of Colorado will have a state level gun initiative. The one in Colorado is a tax. So Colorado is looking to be the second state outside of California to institute a state level excise tax on gun and ammunition sales. But beyond that proposal, it's all quiet on guns when it comes to ballot measures.
It is pretty fascinating not to see any of these other measures make it onto any ballot anywhere.
Yeah.
Right? Pro-gun or pro-gun control, right? Like, it's kind of fascinating. I guess it kind of speaks to what we were talking about earlier with, like, just not a top priority in this election.
Right.
It also may explain, I think, why Trump has, while he backed off of making big gun rights policy promises, he hasn't really changed his positions on guns in this election the same way he has with abortion, right? Like, he's gone a lot harder on trying to soften his image on abortion than he has on guns. And I think part of that is because the pro-choice people have had way more success in showing they can get ballot initiatives on the ballot, for one, and win them in red states.
Yeah.
And you have not seen anything like that from the gun control crowd. Not even close, really. I mean, if anything, ballot initiatives kind of undermine Trump's whole line about how gun owners don't vote, because what we've seen in ballot initiatives since 2016 is that they tend, the gun restriction ones tend to significantly underperform compared to, especially like national polling on the issue. The one that we always, I think, talk about as a sort of the main example of this is the main, no pun intended, the main 2016 universal background check initiative, which failed to pass, even though universal background checks poll nationally at over 80% support. But you can see there's more recent ones, or even ones that have passed. I think there was Nevada passed the universal background check ballot initiative, but they barely passed. This was like 1%, and it got tied up in red tape for a while after that. You saw Oregon passed a gun control initiative, and Washington. But again, it's Oregon and Washington. These are deep blue states, and they barely passed. The Oregon one in particular, I think it was like a 1% passage on stuff that polls a lot higher in theory. And then, of course, you've seen pro-gun initiatives pass with overwhelming votes, like in Iowa, right, where they had a relatively like in the weeds initiative as well. It was about how judges, the standard they use to interpret or to judge gun laws. They wanted a strict scrutiny standard, which is actually different from what the Supreme Court uses, for instance. But the state judges in Iowa have to use strict scrutiny, which is the highest, basically, standard of scrutiny, because of a ballot initiative that passed like over two thirds of the vote. It's 66%, I think it was. So, there just hasn't been that same level of weakness among gun rights advocates on in a really obvious way, in a way that, because ballot initiatives are a direct vote by actual people. And so how they perform gives you at least some indication, some direct indication of how that issue is doing in real life among actual voters.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd say there's no more accurate polling than actual votes being tallied to adopt or not adopt a particular policy. And that's an interesting distinction, but I hadn't thought of that, between the abortion ballot measures that even in red states are passing with flying colors.
Kansas.
Yeah. So that is interesting. And
Trump's noticed that. He's talked about it. Trump's not, he often is not like hiding his reasoning for why he does things. He's pretty open about it often. So, that probably is one of the big things that has driven his, the difference between how he's treated gun policy and abortion policy. But yeah, it's interesting, just not a lot of action in this election, one way or the other. So I guess all eyes will be on your state for how that particular initiative goes.
Yeah.
It's also an interesting one because it's not just an anti-gun or provision. It's also a tax provision.
Right.
So you would think it has a hard hill to climb, but we'll see. Colorado's changed a lot over the years.
I would say, and the trend, just being a political watcher in Colorado, is voters here don't like broad-based taxes, but if it's a tax on a particular group, they pass it. So like they pass nicotine taxes by ballot initiative.
Syntax.
I have a feeling it'll pass, but I haven't seen any polling, so we'll have to see. And obviously we'll report on the results because it's the only ballot measure that we'll be watching this November. So we'll follow it. And then the last link we want to hit on before we wrap up here is just, there's a story from the Huffington Post. All the big major national gun control groups this week issued a big release about a new coalition that they're building with state lawmakers across the country to try and, I suppose, put their focus politically at the state level. We were talking a little bit before. I'm not sure how much this changes in terms of their strategy. I'm not sure what your takeaway was from seeing this announcement.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it's more direct cooperation, but I feel like all the groups listed, and it's all the major gun control groups, Giffords and Grady and Everytown and March for Our Lives, are working together with this group of legislators. I mean, I kind of feel like they're already working together. And so maybe it formalizes that as relationships and will make the efforts they're already undertaking smoother or more efficient, I guess would be the idea of doing this, or just as sort of a political signifier. Like you can, instead of saying you're endorsed by Everytown or whatever, you can say you're a member of this group as a legislator. Maybe that gives some officials a boost. I don't know. I'm fairly skeptical that it means anything, to be honest with you, in practice. Because like they're already working on these things, and I think you mentioned they're all Democrats who've joined this group. It's not like some and I don't know that I haven't seen anyone mention any surprising names on the list either. So these are all people who are already working for these ends. They already wanted to institute gun control. Honestly, what we've seen in the U.S. at the state level to this point is red states pass pro-gun bills, blue states pass gun restrictions, and purple states don't do a lot on guns.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is going to change any of that. Frankly, the larger macro factors at play here, but we'll keep an eye on it for sure. I don't know if there's anything quite like this on the other side. Nothing that I can think of, right? Maybe, I mean, there's like legislative groups out there, ALEC and stuff like that. But, I don't know if there's, I think if you're a pro-gun person who just would join, you'd work with the NRA or GOA or FPC or one of these other groups. And mostly the NRA, as far as there's a lot of state-based groups too that have pull inside their individual states. But, the NRA traditionally, this is one of the problems with the NRA's collapse in recent years. Is like the NRA has driven a lot of state level organizing, and especially on the sort of legislating side of things, being the professional group to go and talk to about whatever, and having lobbyists go there. So, they're doing less of that now because they have fewer resources. But I don't know. Overall, I don't know that it's going to matter, but we'll have to see. Yeah,
that to me was the if it ends up being anything, that would be the interesting aspect, is as the NRA has less of a presence at the state level, if this group can gain a foothold in more states. But like I said, they've only reached out to Democratic lawmakers so far. So it could end up just being, like you said, more blue states doing the same thing blue states were already doing, and then red states still doing the same thing red states were doing.
But there's an opening now with the decline of the NRA for these groups to try and do something. So, I mean, I guess this might be part of that, and we'll see if it has any effect. If we start seeing gun restrictions pop up in red states, you'll know, or at least purple states, more purple states getting stuff through. that'll be a way out. But yeah, you're right. I think that it's just Democrats probably signals there's not. This will help in places where Democrats already control everything, which are going to be places that already have basically every gun restriction you could ask for. So we'll see. But yeah, I don't know. So you're where are you at this week, by the way? You're on.
I was going to say, listeners and viewers probably can see that this isn't my normal, and I probably don't sound like I normally do because I don't have my studio set up here. But yeah, I'm podcasting from a hotel room in New Jersey. I'm in Stone Harbor, New Jersey, here for a wedding.
The Jersey Shore.
I am on the shore. Not doing much beach stuff. I unfortunately have to attend weddings and go to
in September. Yeah, end of September. Probably pretty cold in that water.
Yeah. I can't imagine. It's at least the weather's very nice, so I can at least walk around the town, and it's a cool little beach town. So I'm enjoying that. But so yeah, I'm from the East Coast this week.
There you go. All right. Yeah, no, well, I hope you have fun. Sorry that you had to do the show from your hotel room, but
no problem.
You've already got your piece done for the weekend, so you got it's all to yourself now. Have a good time out there. I'm going up to Pennsylvania, so we won't be too far apart, I guess, this weekend. I'm going up to the farm to see family for a birthday party for my friend's kid, and just to have a good time up in Pennsylvania. Probably watch the Phillies lose they need like one game. They need to win one game to clinch their playoff spot. And they've lost these last two games. So hopefully they can pull it out tonight. That'd be nice. But, and then of course the stupid Eagles fell apart at the end of their Monday night game. And now they're playing the Saints, who are like good at football for some reason this year. So I don't know what's going to happen there. Hopefully they figure things out. Maybe the defensive line will remind everyone that they exist. We'll see. I don't have a lot of confidence at this point, but I suppose at least they're not the Broncos who, have they sat Bo Nix yet, or
nope?
That's just Bryce Young, right? Bryce Young.
Yeah, it's just Bryce Young. They're gonna let Bo Nix struggle and figure it out, or sink or swim.
Good luck. Hope he does something. I already had to drop Sutton from my fantasy team, though. Sorry.
Don't blame you.
I couldn't keep stringing that along for too long. But yeah, hopefully things turn out a little bit better this week. But that's all we've got for you guys. The Dispatch is back with an ad this week, so I'm going to throw it over to myself, telling you a little bit about them. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of, Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Alla Pundit. I mean, there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.